One thing which has been omitted just occurs, although it is not very material to the main argument. The Secretary of State affirms that the bill only contemplates a repayment, not a loan, to the government. But here he is certainly mistaken. It is true the government invests in the stock of the bank a sum equal to that which it receives on loan. But let it be remembered that it does not, therefore, cease to be a proprietor of the stock, which would be the case if the money received back were in the nature of a payment. It remains a proprietor still, and will share in the profit or loss of the institution, according as the dividend is more or less than the interest it is to pay on the sum borrowed. Hence that sum is manifestly, and in the strictest sense, a loan. This was written by Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for the United States in February of 1791, when the United States was discussing and considering the Bank of the United States. Please bear in mind, at the time, the House of Representatives and the Senate had enough votes to pass the bill, but the Secretary of the State, who at the time was Thomas Jefferson, as well as many other noted members of the Continental Congress, were very much opposed to the bill. It was a charter for 20 years, and after 20 years, the charter was not renewed. It wasn't canceled. Nobody decided to default. Nobody violated the agreement. They decided not to extend the charter. Now, we're a far cry away from 1791, but we are in a very serious situation now, where in the last 20 to 30 years especially, several events have occurred in the United States regarding the financial sector independent of the government, and in the manners in which the government intersects, going all the way back to the S&L crisis of the 80s, and then later financial crises. We see that there are efforts to say that there is a specific kind of process for evaluating the federal budget, taking into consideration long-term obligations, concepts of what capital outlays are, and what it means to characterize things at one point of time, and then to adjudge them to potentially be available for recharacterization for investment in another manner at a later part in time. But if they lie to you and tell you it's a loan, when they've already hooked it up as a way to, as they call, reprogram one budget line for another or to another, to basically transfer assets from one line to another, and then in the process they're doing, don't disclose to you that they've recalibrated whatever the considerations of that loan are, I believe this actually proves it was never a loan to begin with. And that is why during the 2008 banking bailout, most of the major banks and some of the smaller banks were able to get, for certain elements of their banking enterprise, payoffs from the government that they did not have to pay back. Subsidies, accounts that on a balance sheet would appear 100% in the red. There were loans that they were given for a time, while the actual assets of their organization, some of them, were literally turned over to the federal government, where the federal government, via Treasury, actually operated as if they were personally the shareholders of those organizations. And at that time, America was being reprogrammed to see healthcare access as a civil right, a human right. The primary modus of our society and our economy was to revolve around healthcare, which was put into competitive state marketplace models. The thing is, it was never a loan to the banks. It was part of a strategic capital outlay process that allowed for them to take federal subsidies to create massive pools of liability that they've been leveraging ever since, and obscuring in the process of accumulating medical billings that are supposed to be anonymized after a certain amount of time so that they can be used in the recapitulation of the derivatives market. Trillions of dollars globally in derivatives nobody accounts for. Nobody addresses honestly or directly. There are laws about how to work with derivatives. And nobody follows those any more than they follow the laws about requiring Congress, requiring the Senate, requiring the federal government to adhere to an appropriate process when it comes to the federal budget. Enshrined in law, a law they haven't changed, but a law they just refuse to follow because they don't expect us to ever find out about how they literally will just change the law when it doesn't suit them. And in some cases, they won't even change the law because they leverage the appearance based on the actual fact of the matter. Now, could somebody have in 20 years, while that bank was chartered, perhaps have brought a case before the Supreme Court of the United States and said, what's happening is illegal? And there were these matters for consideration, and even though Congress voted for it at the time, the president himself asked his cabinet members to provide some reflection on its propriety, and the cabinet members, a couple of them, as well as some of the dissenters within the Senate and the Congress, were very adamant against the passage of this legislation. And in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, we have seen how these policies connected with the Bank of the United States have been contrary to the well-being of the United States and have actually provided very significant harm to the future financial and economic development of our country. We need to cancel that. And we need to base it on constitutional grounds where the judicial branch demonstrates its discretion to weigh in on matters as important as these. There was plenty of documentation, there was plenty of evidence, there was plenty of appropriate precedent that had already been put into the dissent that had been provided, and the warnings of what could potentially manifest if these egregious violations of the Constitution were allowed to be abrogated in order to pass a bill that was unconstitutional under the illusion it would provide some sort of convenience, as Thomas Jefferson said, or would excitate the pleasure, as Thomas Jefferson also said, in a manner that may artificially stimulate the economy for a short period of time, but would not allow for the kind of safety and security that the country needed to prosper long term. That could very, very well have happened. It could very, very well have happened in the last 10 years. It could very well have happened in the last 20 years. But so far it has not. At some point, this accounting comes due. The question is, who is going to be in charge of the ledgers? Because if you loan out those ledgers, if you give over that economic data to somebody else and they have a different consideration of the importance of constitutional processes, then you may have pretty much relinquished the entire legacy of your country. Adhering to the Constitution and recognizing the rights of the people of the United States outside of any university, any secret society, in any language, and outside of any high-level security document that was apparently mischaracterized and has been for the last 30 years for everybody that has one, is very important, not just for people in the United States, but people around the world.